Good evening, everyone. Jason Buensalido here of Buensalido Architects, one of IDC 2020's event partners, and I will be your moderator for this evening. We will be beginning our session in just a moment, but before we get on with this evening's program, like all of our previous sessions, I'm going to be asking you a poll question. And the question is this: which of these indigenous technologies was born in the Philippines? Kihamba, Waffle Gardens, or Muyong? Just to give you an idea, I'll be giving a short description of each of these choices. Kihamba is an innovative agroforestry system that has sustained communities of people for over the past 100 years. It is a highly ecological and sustainable cropping system that mostly focuses on banana and coffee. Waffle gardens are sunken plots with hard, hand-built adobe-like walls that catch and hold water close to plant roots for extended periods, offering wind protection and temperature control while limiting evaporation and erosion to crops. Muyong are traditionally inherited properties and are privately owned, although owners do not possess title deeds. Ownership is simply defined by inheritance, and this mode of ownership transfer is highly respected and recognized by everybody within the cultural vein. The Muyong plays an important role within the tribal economy. It is the primary source of fuel wood, construction materials, food, and medicine for the home and the community. Interesting. So you may now put in your answers, and while you're doing that, I would like to thank IDC 2020's partners. Firstly, Adobo Magazine, the official media partner of IDC 2020, and British Council, and of course us at Buensalido Architects as event partners. So now that I've given you a bit of warm-up with that poll question, I think we're all ready for tonight's speaker. She is a multifaceted designer with an expertise in indigenous technologies, a renowned landscape designer, environmentalist, and educator, among many, many other things. Her best-selling book with passion, Low Tech, Designed by Radical Indigenism, highlights her passion for innovations driven by nature, resilience, and culture. Let's all welcome Julia Watson.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Julia. Welcome to the International Design Conference, Design Futures, Better Normal by Design. Glad you can join us.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. This is incredibly exciting to be here.
Yeah, so I guess it's good morning to you and
It
good evening
is.
to us here in the Philippines. I understand we have quite a bit of time difference.
We do 12 hours.
Yeah, and I trust you've had your coffee as I've had
I
my tea.
have.
Yeah, so I think I'm not alone when I say that I'm very excited to, I guess, learn a lot and listen to these ideas that you're going to put forth in today's session.
Okay, great. I'm
Yeah,
excited to be here too.
yeah. With that, guys, I'll leave you for a bit, and I'll join you when we get to our Q&A, or as we like to call it here, our fireside chat. I guess the virtual stage is yours, Julia.
Okay, I'll see you soon.
See you.
All right, good evening, everybody. Very excited to be here and to be able to present this work to you. But before we begin, I'd actually like to begin the lecture by giving an acknowledgement, which is something we do here in America. And it's also something that's very traditionally done in Australia, where I'm originally from. And it's an acknowledgement that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Lenape people, who were the first people of Brooklyn here in New York, where I am located. And I'm honoring with gratitude the land and the Lenape people, both past and present. And now I'd like to present my talk to you today, designed by Radical Indigenism. So I want to begin actually where we are today in the world, the time that we're in. But also going back just a couple of months to when this period first began and when COVID actually first hit the US. And we were all suddenly scrambling to find these personal protective equipment, or PPP, as we call it here. And I'd actually just returned from Australia, where everyone was already wearing masks, but it wasn't because of these viral transmissions. And it's really a story that's becoming all too familiar around the globe. There were large parts of my country that were on fire, and this fire was sparked by seasonal drought, by delayed rains, and by underfunded prevention. And also there's this century-old ban on the use of traditional technology called cultural burning that was established by settler states. But in the midst of this catastrophe, we learned something incredibly interesting, and that was that the ancestral lands that had still practiced this cultural burning, we also call it pyrotechnology. In Australia, it's also called fire stick farming. Those lands were actually fine, and these incredible fires actually went around these lands. And this Indigenous pyrotechnology, it's been evolved over millennia. It's actually used all around the world. And it cut down the destructive impact of the wildfires by half. And trees, they survived because of the practice of slow burning, this cultural burning. And this cultural burning is guided by traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. And that's been passed down through mythology. And today, right now, in the present day, we're witnessing seasonal fires, and I'm sure you've heard they're raging across the American West, but not just America, Siberia, the Arctic, Indonesia, Argentina, and Brazil, and it's raging with similar ferocity around the globe. So while we understand that wildfires pose a threat as a global phenomenon, and they are definitively an indicator of climate change, they're also a man-made disaster because we have the ancient technology that we know can prevent them. But also, amidst this new normal of wearing face masks, I became really interested in how people across the globe had been fashioning face masks from anything they had laying around, like an old scarf, a plastic bottle, airplane shades, cabbage leaves. And in that same way that people have been making their very own personal protective equipment, local communities have been making their very own local technologies in response to climate crisis or similar crisis for millennia. And what I find so incredibly fascinating about these technologies, which I cover in my book, is how complex they are, how attuned they are to nature, and also how resilient we could all become by learning from and observing them. And so this is low tech. It was an idea that started in 2012. And it started when I was actually working on Bali's first UNESCO World Heritage project with the Indonesian government. And that project was a project to preserve 40,000 acres of sacred rice terraces on the island of Bali. But in actual fact, this research began a long time before that. And it began looking at technologies from my home country in Australia. And it started in my second year of architecture, which was actually a really long time ago, with a seminar course in Australia that was called Aboriginal Environments. And this course was pretty incredible because it was a core seminar course in second year architecture degree. That's not normal. That's not normal anywhere that I've taught around the world. This was very unique to have an Indigenous environment course as part of your second year core architecture. It was taught by Dr. Paul Memmott. He's a world-renowned anthropologist and an architect, and it literally changed my whole perspective, the whole history that I'd been taught about my country and about the land and about the previous ownership. And this is an image of the oldest human-made structure that exists on Earth, and it dates back 40,000 years. This is presumed oldest structure on Earth, and it's in Australia, in the state that is just below mine, Queensland. It's in New South Wales. And what it actually is, it's called the Brewery fish traps, and it's about 1/3 of a mile long, and it's sited along a large natural rock bar on the Barwon River, and it's right at the bend where the now township of Brewery sits. But it's been there for 40,000 years, far longer than that actual township. And it's made of large and small rocks that have been placed to divert water, but then also divert fish into small pools that once the fish were trapped, they could be then hand collected. So after architecture school, I went on to study landscape architecture, having become fascinated with this idea of the way that we relate to our landscapes and to the land. And I wanted to explore different ways that people have been doing that. And then I started researching an island very close to where you are and closer to my home country, the island of Borneo. And I was really interested in the work by this person who's in the center of the screen, Bruno Manser. I was also very interested in the work of Wade Davis at the time. He'd written about this community called the Panan people. Wade Davis went on to write the foreword for my book 20 years later. So I've been following the work of Wade, who's an incredible anthropologist, for about 20 years. But I was fascinated by Manser's work at the time. And he'd been working with this nomadic forest dwelling community called the Panan people. And he'd been assisting them in their activist work to try and protect their forests from illegal logging, or actually legal logging, by the Malaysian government. But that year before I visited the year before I visited that island, Bruno Manser actually went missing. So I went to the island to kind of try and search for this community and look at the forest and look at this landscape. And on my trip to Borneo, I visited this very small and a sedentary community of the Panan people. They had actually been removed from their forested landscapes and they'd been relocated to government housing. It was really during this trip that I sort of came to understand that there are so many different ways of living and relating to nature. And sometimes that these different ways of living and related to nature, they were being displaced by this global dominant form of understanding development and progress, and that there could be other ways for us to live and other things to learn from different communities around the world that could turn us in a different direction and offer us an alternative future. And that began my research into the many concepts that I've been exploring since traveling the world, under the suspicion that some of our most sustainable innovations might actually be rooted in cultures who figured out some of these ideas to deal with crisis a millennia ago. And scientists, they have acknowledged, and we're all very aware at this point in time, that we're in the midst of a period that we will come to know in the future, and we know now is a 6th mass extinction of life on Earth. And what we haven't really understood is that species alone will not be the 21st century's greatest loss, because those exact same forces that are driving species extinction, they also endanger the indigenous cultures and the indigenous technologies, those nature-based technologies that we haven't yet even recognized as technologies in some cases that may actually hold a key to understanding our survival. And these are technologies that have been evolved and been passed through generations in response to exactly same conditions that we're confronting now with climate change. So flooding and fire and drought, sea level rise, severe weather, and they're the same crisis that we're facing today. And these technologies, they are incredibly well adapted to their environments. And in fact, they play a key role in conserving the biodiversity in these landscapes. And that's why these relationships are so intertwined. And what I actually get a little bit skeptical of and become a little bit confused by at this moment where we are now, recognizing that climate mitigation is at the forefront of what needs to happen, is that when we talk about climate mitigating solutions, we're still sort of stuck in this paradigm and thinking on the grounds of conservation and thinking on the grounds of these landscapes that we package and we put into these conservation areas, and then we leave them untouched and they're pristine. And this is this is a concept that actually began in the United States. And so it's this idea that, you know, we need to keep these systems completely undeveloped in wetlands, forests, deserts, and mountain landscapes. But often cases, these systems have already been managed by communities for a very long time prior to them being put in the boundaries of a national park or a preservation or conservation zone. So we think of these climate mitigation solutions as wetlands, rather than considering that there are thousands of ways that local communities have adapted, and they've also developed these landscapes with incredibly resilient and sophisticated technologies that are more advanced than some of the design thinking that we employ today. And so today, I work as a landscape architect and an urban designer, and something new that started happening is I started consulting with really large corporations on the future of their innovation and where they can head with their business models and their understanding of building sustainability into those models. I also teach, and recently I wrote this book, Low Tech, Designed by Radical Indigenism. And I want to take a moment just to explain the title of low tech, because it's not obvious, because it's a word that I completely made up. But it's made of a combination of two words, low tech, T-E-C-H, and T-E-K. And it makes absolute sense once you actually read the book and given the material in the book. But what most people don't actually understand, it's kind of a bit of a provocation. It's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, and it's really poking fun at our inherited biases and our ideas of these technologies, because incredibly ignorantly, we see these technologies often referred to as low tech or primitive. And they're not that way. They are incredibly sophisticated. They embody all of today's sustainability principles of low embodied energy and low impact and low cost, and forming closed looped systems. And so for the TK part of that title, this is actually the foundational knowledge of the book. And TEK means traditional ecological knowledge, and it is the cumulative body of multi-generational knowledge and practices and beliefs. And so TK is a system of nested concepts, and they explain the construction of the world around an individual in its traditional form. And that includes one's local knowledge, of one's understanding of lands and ecosystems, one's understanding of land management and management of resources, and the social institutions which one exists within, and then the worldview surrounding that. And surprisingly, there are many, many different worldviews, as there are many different ways of understanding how human beings can relate to nature. And just lastly, the term radical indigenism. A lot of these concepts are pretty new, so I wanted to take a moment to actually explain them all. Radical indigenism, it is a philosophy of Princeton professor and citizen of the Cherokee Nation, Eva Marie Garut. And Garut argues for a rebuilding of knowledge through explorations of Indigenous philosophies that are capable of generating new knowledge and new dialogues. And this is really important, because this is really the foundation of where the low-tech movement will head, and where we want to get to. This is the beginning. This is a moment in time where we're really starting to broaden, look over the horizon and see the sun sort of rising, and say there is so much that we can explore. There is so much more that we need to know. From these understandings, this generating of new knowledge will and needs to happen, and these new dialogues need to happen, and that's what we're doing today. And in Low Tech, the book, what I did was bring this type of thinking into the sphere of design and sustainability, where it is incredibly relevant and makes absolute sense, by arguing for a new look at local knowledge, Indigenous understandings of environments and their technologies, as well as practices, resource management, and belief systems, to inform how we conceive of sustainability and resilience thinking. So as I said, low tech, I really do conceive of this as a movement to rebuild understanding, new knowledge, new philosophies, and new technologies based upon these understandings and understandings of vernacular architecture and infrastructure, most importantly, that generates sustainable, climate resilient infrastructures. And so in 2012, that's when I began writing Low Tech. But I was also teaching a seminar course at Columbia University. It was the first seminar course that I had ever taught straight out of graduate school, and it was called Landscape Ecotechnology. And this was really a burgeoning discipline at that time. A lot of books were coming out. There was a seminal book called Living Technologies. But really, when you looked at it, there was a lot of high-tech solutions. And so the material for this course that I was designing and teaching, it was mostly high-tech solutions for the built environment. And this is an example that I wanted to show you of some of the students' work from back then, just because I still have professors that come up to me when I see them now, 8 years later, and they mention this particular project. It was a really incredible project. But what's interesting about it, it's a bridge. It's a bridge that cleans water. It's infused with water quality indicating piezoelectric lights. It has carbon nanotube sponges that absorb oil and then retain buoyancy. It has oysters, each of which naturally filter 5 liters of liters of water per hour attached to these poles that are lighting mechanisms that are operable by pedestrians crossing the bridges. So it was an incredible concept, but still, it was all about the high tech. In 1966, the architect Cedric Price, he asked an incredibly important question, not just for then, also for now. He asked, if technology is the answer, what was the question? And this provoked the field of design to question the impact of technology on architecture, on cities, and on societies. 60 years later, we're asking a similar question. If sustainability is the answer, what was the question? Because we can keep on going up higher and we can keep on going out wider and we can keep on going deeper to extract. But to what end will sustainability assist us if we don't systemically can change the conditions by which we're developing and progressing and also destroying our planet? So as we seemingly are drowning in this age of information while starving for wisdom, we find ourselves at a crossroads. And we can either continue a very narrow view of technology that was informed by our distance from nature 400 years ago in the Enlightenment period, or that actually took a very small portion of technology available on Earth and sort of progressed that technology, or we can acknowledge that the current dominant model of progress, especially within our profession, is just one way and not the only way for us to relate to the natural world and to respond to climate change. And the question is, what will we understand by looking to the many hundreds, if not thousands, of communities who've been scaling highly sustainable environmental systems for hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of years? And if we're going to get really serious about mitigating climate change, we need to consider that the most effective way to do this is not simply by replicating high-tech and costly solutions that are developed by wealthy nations. There is an assistive, there is a collaborative, there is a process that needs to be coinciding and happening with that at the same time, not to negate that these technologies are incredibly important to help us transition towards renewable energies and to mitigate climate change. But there is a whole world of technologies that needs to also be explored in combination with this. So, the most effective way that I can see to mitigate climate change in that realm of technologies is to recognize that a solution embedded in the TEK of the peoples and the environments that already exist will be and is one of the most effective forms of resilience at scale. And now I want to go through 3 technologies from the book as multi-scalar approaches exploring material, module, and system scale. And this is the first one, which many of you might recognize this community. So living amongst the highest mountains in the Philippines and calling themselves the Sky People, The Ifugao are known as the Masters of Terracing. They are the unrivaled terrace builders of the world, and they use water and soil and rocks as their construction tools to cultivate slopes of up to 70, sometimes 80-degree slopes. And their terraces, they're not just agricultural systems and sort of this idea that they're heritage agricultural systems. They are unique micro watersheds, and they serve as rainwater filter systems. The steep mountainside landscapes actually, they're a limit to agricultural practices, but the Ifugao innovated and they transformed these otherwise unusable hillsides into incredibly productive land. And this is an innovation which we see simultaneously evolving across the earth, using terracing on unarable land or mountainous landscapes to grow. So this combination of shallow water, really high nutrient levels, and high primary productivity is also incredibly ideal for the growth of organisms at the base of the food web. And so many species actually rely on the terraces for food and water and shelter from the base of the food chain. And that actually has a cascading effect up the food chain. And these terraces are incredibly important for migration and breeding, making them really important for global biodiversity. And the terraces, the known as Palayan, they're a finely tuned system, and they respond to lunar cycles, to land use zoning, and to soil types. And they exhibit this mastery of complex pest control regimes based on the processing of a variety of herbs. And this is all accompanied by religious rituals. And the terracing technology, it has endured through cultural practices like planting and ceremony. There are 12 rice rituals that are performed by the Mumbaki or the shaman, and they define the Ifugao agrarian calendar. And conducted through the rice growing cycle, these cycles are actually a way to maintain the ecological balance of the terraces and to promote really incredibly bountiful harvests as well. And the elevated environment is reliant on harmonizing climate as well as really complex biological management. And you can see all these different zones of management depicted on this image, from the Mugalan, the Payao, to the Muyong. And these types of terraces are now considered actually one of the most important ecosystems in the world, acting as these massive absorption and purification systems and as nutrient and biodiversity storehouses. So with this scale and with this steepness that we know is incredibly synonymous to the scale, the steepness, the tectonics of skyscrapers, the biological performance really does have the potential to inform the integration of vertical landscaping in the way that we see it now, which is really sort of facade systems rather than integrated systems into the tectonics of the buildings. So it hints about our urban agriculture, our urban vertical environments. Why couldn't they become similar havens for different forms of life, for terrestrial, airborne, and aquatic, as they are in these types of systems? The second system is an islanding and housing system, and it's made from a single species of reed. It's called the Altala Islands and the Madif houses of the Madan people who live in the southern wetlands of Iraq. And the Madan, they make these islands, you can see by this series on the left, of different illustrations showing how these islands are made in stages. And initially they actually make they take an existing group of reeds, they enclose this by a reed fence. Then on top of that, they overlay the reeds and then the mud and then the reeds until they form this floating platform. On top of this platform, they actually create then these Madif houses, which are these cathedral-like arched houses. And what's really interesting is we know how old this type of technology is because we've seen it depicted in Sumerian Uruk imagery that is 6,500 years old. So this is a technology that comes from deep time, that is still in existence, still being constructed. Similarly, 6,500 years later. And this is all made from this single species of reed, as I mentioned. It's called the kasab. And it's really not just integral as a building material, it's integral to every single aspect of life. It provides food for water, it provides food for humans, it provides fodder for the water buffalo, which is the animal that lives very closely within the community of the Madan people. It's incredibly important, obviously, as a building material. It's biodegradable. It creates the islands. It creates these cathedral-like houses. And these houses are actually constructed in as little as 3 days. So they're incredibly mobile. And these dried kasab reed, it is so versatile as a construction material. It can be bundled into these incredible columns. It can be also then bundled into these smaller rafter systems. It can be woven into walls, into floors, into roofs. And then, if you look closely, you can see that it can even be twisted into rope that can bind these buildings without the use of nails. There are no nails, there's no glass, and until recently, there was no electricity. So this building material has been mastered into this incredible versatility of different types of material technologies to construct these particular types of systems. And these Madan villages, they've been constructed in the marshes as they have been, as I mentioned, for many, many generations. But these islands, they actually stay afloat for 25 years. Lastly, the last example that I wanted to show you, it's an incredible example. It's not a 6,500-year-old example, it's a 100-year-old example. And so in parts of the world where rivers are contaminated with sewage, there's actually one Indian city of 15 million people that uses its floodplains to treat half of the wastewater that comes out of its city. And it does this through a combination of sunshine and sewerage with algae, in a symbiosis with algae and bacteria. And that process breaks the wastewater down in a process that takes 30 days. And the wastewater comes into this system about 95% water with 5% waste, and it moves out of this system very clean. So on the edges of Calcutta is where this system actually exists. And it's on the edges of the city where the city is growing. It's flanked by this smoking escarpment of the city's trash that's called the Dapa. And it's ribboned by the highways of the city. And that's where this Indigenous technology of 300 fish ponds lives that cleans the city's water. But not only that, it cleans the city's water while producing fish, rice, and vegetables that actually feed the city as well. And so really, when you look at this technology, you can see that it is not just a model for chemical and coal power free purification. It provides over 100,000 jobs to the city. And as the city's core has no formal treatment, it's actually the only way that the city can clean its wastewater before it enters the Bay of Bengal. And I want to state that the community of fishermen who work in the city, they offer this service. They actually make a living by selling the fish, but the service of cleaning the wastewater for the city is done for free. They have no compensation from any parties to provide this service of cleaning the water, even though it saves the city approximately $22 million if they were to run an STP or a sewage treatment plant to clean the same amount of wastewater for the city. So I want to mention that this thinking isn't new, and this thinking really has been evolved over a long time, and that's what designers and architecture is really about. It's about, especially with research and theoretical understandings, it's about dialogues. It's about dialogues with designers who have come before, designers from allied fields, people from completely other disciplines. But within this book, I think there's an understanding that this is about dialogues with other members of other communities. But initially, this book was really inspired by a seminal exhibition called Architecture, or launched from a seminal exhibition called Architecture Without Architects. And that was an exhibition at MoMA in 1967 that was designed by Bernard Rudofsky, who was then director of architecture at MoMA. And so I wanted to reference this because this is a very seminal book in architecture, and you can see that this is an extension of that conversation, albeit a very different extension of that conversation, and it is different because it involves members of the communities and the cultures that were written about, like Jim Anote, and Jim is a Zuni tribal elder. He's the director of the Museum for the Zuni and the Heritage Center. And there was a lot of back and forth over the chapter to see what could be published, to see what was allowable, to get permission to publish the material from the particular culture and from the community about the technology. The book was also born of conversations with many people. One of them, most important, is Jassim Al-Assadi. And I had worked on a project with Jassim 8 years ago, assisting a team to design wastewater treatment parklands to convert water coming out of cities around the southern wetlands of Iraq into clean water before it entered the system of the southern wetlands, to try and reflood that landscape that had been drained by Saddam Hussein. So Jassim Al-Assadi, he is a Madan born of these marshes, and he's an engineer. He's also a scientist, and he now leads an Indigenous organization to protect his culture. And Jassim provided a lot of imagery for the book. He was interviewed for the book. And for all the interviews that are in the book, each of these interviews were published in Indigenous dialect first and then published in English, as you can see here. And so low-tech suggests that there are nature-based solutions to climate change that don't need to be passive conservation areas, don't need to only be passive conservation areas like forests, where, for example, we have the Khasi Hill tribe, who have evolved this incredibly amazing bridge innovation that are called the living root bridges. And they can be active, these areas can be active and adaptive, and they can be complex coexistences of many human and non-human species that use biodiversity as a building block for the future, like the living bridges that you can see here. This is how the living bridges, it might be the only footage that I've been able to find of the initial construction stages of a living bridge. And what they're actually using is bamboo that is scaffolded across the river. And on either side of the river where the bamboo begins, there are 2 Ficus elastica trees. And the roots of the Ficus elastica tree are then woven into this scaffolding of bamboo to create the base that this living bridge will grow from. And once that bamboo has rotted, which it does in this area of the world, Meghalaya, which has the highest rainfall on Earth, the roots of the living bridge continue to grow until they form something like this. And so this tradition of growing living root bridges, it's actually a 1,500-year-old tradition. It was originally thought that it came from Laos, as people from Laos actually migrated up into this area. They brought this technology with them. And at the moment, there are 75 structures that take about 50 years to grow, but in this landscape, they last for centuries. And just the other day, I had a person who, since I've published the book, has been contacting me, and he is in northern Queensland in Australia, and he's been trying to construct living root bridges, and he says that he has one growing in under 2 years at this point in time. So people are starting to think about the different types of application of these technologies around the world. And so, in summary, whether it's carbon emissions or viral transmissions, ecosystem resilience is fundamental to mitigating climate change, as well as meeting global pandemic. And climate change has shown us that our survival is not dependent upon superiority. It is dependent upon symbiosis. And shifting our thinking from this idea of survival of the fittest and superior over nature has to happen. And it has to shift towards survival of the symbiotic and working with nature. And it's a really critical first step for us to engage this idea and this concept, especially as designers. Because can you imagine what we could learn from the thousands of nature-based technologies about how design and different types of technologies and settlements could evolve and could evolve future alternative futures for us, and so that we might combat the mistakes we've made in past and we won't replicate them into our future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julia, for sharing what you just did. No, I guess Avatar is real after all. Yeah. So, if anything, it's really such an eye-opening series of thoughts, and very provocative at that. I guess it makes one realize that there may be a big possibility that we have been understanding this idea of progress in an incorrect kind of manner. We think about our cities, the way that civilizations have succumbed to, say, greed, power, wealth, money, and all of these worldly things. When it seems to me that progress doesn't seem to be worth it when we're sort of compromising nature, humanity, cultures, old ways of living along the way, right? I mean, as evidenced by the great fires that have been occurring all over the world, Australia, America, Brazil, Argentina, like what you said.
Yeah.
I guess it also makes me think of this idiom that you know the saying that sometimes the answer is right in front of you. All of these things that you've shared have actually been around for such a long time, offering nature-based and human-centric solutions, while us as humanity, we keep on creating and inventing new technologies that kind of degrade our environment in the process. So as you said, knowledge really has to be built or even rebuilt, especially when it comes to the perception of low tech and how it can be used to move forward. And I think that is the challenge.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I would also say, though, that, I think we're at a stage in this idea of progress where we can almost think of us as in a bit of a juvenile stage of understanding how we interact with nature. And we know now that there needs to be a maturation process. We need to evolve in our maturity as human species and civilizations and say, there's another way to do this. And growing out of sort of a self-centered and sort of a bit of a, I would say, ignorant and perhaps a bit of a selfish mode of juvenile understanding of our species in relationship to Earth. There's just a stage of maturity that we need to go to. And one of this understanding is a moment of maturing and coming towards a more collaborative culture and collaborative existence on Earth, which doesn't think about sort of a win-lose mindset of always gaining and then somebody always losing, of nature losing as humans gain, but this other idea of everybody winning and the environment winning and communities winning and the planet as well. So I think that one doesn't need to think of us as sort of going in the opposite direction, but moving forward.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely agree. But actually, now before we chat with you even further for the Q&A part, we asked the audience a poll earlier, which is this question: which of these indigenous technologies was born in the Philippines? So it's Kihamba, Waffle Gardens, or Muyong. So let's see our answers. I think it's going to be flashed in a while. So most of the audience answered Muyong, which I think is correct. The answer is Muyong. The Muyong system is an agroforestry system practiced in the mountains of Ifugao. And according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, it can be viewed from different perspectives, either as a forest conservation strategy, a watershed rehabilitation technique, a farming system, or an assisted natural regeneration strategy. While the system can be viewed from different perspectives, the role of culture in the development and continued maintenance of the system is pervasive. The Muyong is living proof of the Ifugao's knowledge of silviculture, agroforestry, horticulture, and soil and water conservation. Really interesting. The FAO actually has a really interesting write-up on the Muyong, so perhaps we can link it down below for the audience to further read about it if they're interested. Okay, so let's get back to Julia. I think we've received quite a number of questions already. So how are you, Julia? Ready for your first question?
Yes.
Right, yeah. So while we're collating those questions, maybe I'd like to, throw in a question in the pot regarding solutions of permanence. And I think this is an idea that you have mentioned in one of your talks. Because, if you think about it, like what you said, in the modern world and thinking, we are trained as a civilization, as a society, to always sort of come up with solutions of permanence, of grandeur, of assertion of power, if you may. Superpowers, economies, urban centers, empires have been built around this idea. So the question is, how do you now change this inclination to permanence and get the buy-in of economies, superpowers, developers, when this low-tech approach is often, as like what you said, it's perceived to be there's a negative connotation to it. It's a low economic cost. There's kind of absence of power, more of empathy, more of, everybody winning rather than the self winning, rather than the superpowers winning, perhaps also with limited financial return. So how do you change mindsets of, all of these, I guess, people in control of our built environment?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that to just clarify, I'm not advocating for a reversal or a move away for a high tech. What I'm advocating and what actually comes as the center of the idea of design by radical Indigenism is to say, why should we continue to ignore all these ideas about living soft systems when the most advanced type of thinking in terms of designing for climate mitigation and resilience is to really investigate these soft systems. And the soft systems, they're not as much about permanence and material, concrete, steel, and glass. They're looking at how do we think about the materials of nature and the systems and the chemical reactions and their energetic inputs of nature, and how do we, which is what these types of systems that are looked at in low tech catalyze, how do we think about that as our building materials, and how do we use biodiversity as a building block to conceive of new forms of technologies and knowledge. And so it's really that design by radical Indigenism saying we haven't yet even started the conversation about where could we go, what's available. And if we're really saying like we have to deal with this on a global scale, and we're not just going to deal with this with superpowers and with cities, we have to deal with climate change in all landscapes and with all communities. Are we really going to be the most effective by just scaling these small, high costly infrastructures that we know break down when they need maintenance? Or is the most effective way to really move forward and say, okay, let's generate technologies that that will be symbiotic with our ecosystems. And that doesn't mean that there can't be high-tech systems or high-tech material technologies.
Right.
There just hasn't been that exploration yet. And I think that's an incredibly bountiful horizon for material technologists and for construction systems and construction management to think of what are the alternatives to the way we've done now. We know we have to change in terms of materials in cities to lower our carbon footprints, to reduce embodied energy of materials. This is a way for us to start investigating ways that it has been done for thousands of years that we have yet even to explore.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess what you're saying is there really has to be an investigation, experimentation, a discourse, and a conversation, like what you said, wherein we can come up with sort of a hybrid between the high tech and the low tech. Right?
Yeah.
There's a question from Justine Francois. How can we be resilient about the future learning from Indigenous people? And how can some of their solutions be scaled up?
So there's how can we be resilient? I mean, I think that taking some of the tenets and understandings of these systems, that they're circular, they're regenerative, they're not monocultural, they're not homogenizing, they're heterogeneous, they take advantage of local knowledge, they understand local ecosystems. So the pyrotechnology that is cultural burning, it's actually about soil, it's about flowering times, it's about seasonality, it's about cycles of weather, and taking those conditions rather than a homogenizing universal application of technologies across the world. That's the really big difference, and that's what needs to be evolved. It also is incredibly empowering to individual communities and in individual regions and individual nations in terms of like becoming accountable for regional economic footprints by saying that, you know, we have this knowledge, we understand this ecosystem, we are going to be the best managers of these types of ecosystems, and let us allow these technologies to expand. The scaling question is one that's really interesting because we haven't explored it yet. So it's really a frontier that is open for exploration, but we do have systems that scale. One of them I just showed you, the East Kolkata wetlands.
Right.
Kolkata, the city of 15 million people, it has expanded by 400% in the last 40 years. And as the city's expanded, so is that ecosystem that cleans the water. It started out as a couple of fish farms and now it's 300, and it's expanded at the same time as that system is expanded. And that's what's incredible about Indigenous technologies, is that they embody some of the tenets of resilience, which is adaptability.
Right.
They're built upon the conditions of flooding. So as more flooding occurs, they adapt and evolve. And so some of the fundamental ideas that we now embody in design and resilience thinking, they're already embedded within these technologies. And that's something that's so incredibly interesting that we haven't explored yet.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think the danger with globalization is that, you know, the speed of transfer of technology gives a certain pressure for, let's say, a region to adapt the, say, latest technology in coming in from the West or other parts of the world,
exactly.
without necessarily applying critical thinking that, hey, we actually have a system,
Exactly.
an existing example right in our backyard that we can integrate, right, with all of these new technologies coming in.
I want to just
Sure.
couple with that is that there's, you know, I've looked at polderdike technologies, and we know that the polderdike technology that's been advanced by the Netherlands, it's applied universally around the globe to assist with sea level rise and flooding. But I've seen polderdike technologies in China and in Indonesia that are really effective and that haven't been explored. So we have this conditioning as designers that we have this toolkit of particular technologies, we can apply that everywhere. But there's been pushback from communities now saying that the efficacy of applying universal design methodologies within environments that perhaps have better solutions in existence that are based upon local knowledge and construction techniques, that needs to be questioned.
Right. Yeah. We have a question from Marie Lim. How can we influence today's society to go back to using indigenous methods, and how can these be modernized?
I mean, I think it's already happening. There's a huge push towards regenerative agriculture, and a lot of regenerative agriculture is really looking at indigenous agricultural techniques that really work, that have that circular effect, that regenerate soil conditions, that are responsive to water resource management, and so there's already a shift towards that is actually happening, and it's happening interestingly in the fashion industry.
Okay.
And what's interesting about the fashion industry, it's one of the second largest polluters on earth. And there is a definitive awareness, and I can name companies that are really invested, from very small to very large scale companies that are really invested in pushing forward regenerative agriculture. The issue is, at this moment, in some cases, especially for smaller brands, it's not cost effective. It hasn't been made cost effective because we're still seeing that, you know, supplanting fertilizers and displacing traditional forms of fertilization or pest management somehow that's seen as more of effective and more advanced. And so I think we're beginning to understand that these systems are contemporary. These systems can be integrated into our economic and our distribution, and perhaps even our manufacturing cycles. We just need to push that. And it's going to take a lot of restructuring. It's going to take a really deep investigation at looking at the systems upon which, our economies and our industries are built. But if we don't do this, we know that we're going to keep on following the same line of technologies and models of industry that we know have led us to this place. So why should we keep on following that? Why shouldn't we invest now in our future?
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions with the existing practices, right?
Yeah.
You showed the example of the rice terraces right here in the Philippines in your presentation, and one of the problems actually of that region is this perception of the locals, of the indigenous people there, the perception of modernization, that a lot of them would rather actually migrate to the city, and therefore there's a limited transfer of technology. And when I say technology, it's the way that all of these rice terraces are built. So I guess, how can we counter this or resist, or I guess this resistance to the local indigenous technology, which I guess in a way is related to the other question by Enza here, who are and should be the key players in integrating low tech into our societies, whether urban or other.
The indigenous people are the key. I don't know that I'm advocating for a replication of indigenous technologies in urban centers, and I don't think I'm advocating for a replication of particular indigenous technologies. What we're advocating for is saying, why would we continue to ignore these methods? Why would we continue to ignore hundreds and thousands of examples of how we can construct in symbiosis with nature when we don't have these solutions on the table at the moment? We don't have even the research and understanding about these solutions at this point in time. So I think that we're trying to say that there is a shift that needs to happen, and I think that it's going to happen most likely in our second and third tier growth rings of our cities, in the lands and in the areas that are yet to expand. We know that there's going to be an expansion of our urban centers, but we know it has to happen in a different way. So why can't we look at how these forms of infrastructures and technologies would exist within those landscapes? Why, in Shenzhen, we were looking at a project for an urban axis that was in between the waterfront, the coastal waterfront, and the wetland area. Very low-lying city, traditionally fish farming area with lots of inundation. There is an incredible fish farming, silk rearing technology that's now part of the FAO. I think the FAO is an incredible organization, but we limit these ideas of technologies with the FAO and with these heritage agricultural landscapes to landscapes of the past and landscapes that are only for agriculture, whereas they have these incredible services. Why couldn't we think about our urban axes in our cities still having agriculture? We're completely invested in urban agriculture. Why aren't we in landscapes in cities that are floodable or that flood? Think about, let's not introduce just wetlands into a mangrove ecology. Let's introduce mangroves, and let's introduce fish farming, and these indigenous practices that were once in this landscape 100 years ago have been erased. It's part of the threads and the histories and the culture of these cities. Let's figure out how to reintroduce that back into our urban areas so that it can become these threads of sort of water conduits through our cities. And in response to the first part of the question, I mean, we're incredibly at fault for progressing these ideas that the Western ideas of technology and advancement that have got the rest of the world to this place of climate change. I think we're now recognizing that there's a questioning of this model of progress. There's a questioning of these particular technologies that were taken from a very small subset of technologies available at that time on Earth, and just sort of erased and displaced and ignored so many other technologies. We have to replace value back into those landscapes. We have to recognize that these practices are incredibly important. There is a new understanding of regionality. There's a new understanding of localism, hyperlocalism that's happening within our profession. And we need to ground that and say that these types of systems, these types of understandings of our ecosystems, they're incredibly important, because there is no difference between city and countryside anymore. We see with the fires that fires in the countryside impact our air quality in the cities where we can't go outside for weeks on end. So we need to understand that the management of our countryside, the management of our ecosystems, and the management of our cities are incredibly interdependent. They're symbiotic as well at that scale. So we need to recognize that, and we need to plan our cities in response to that. So these systems that are managed by Indigenous communities, they're vital to our cities as well. And we need to understand the networks of our cities and how incredibly important the relationship between these systems all are.
Yeah, especially with what we're all going through right now. I think there's a heightened focus on hyper localism with what we're going through, right? So we have a question here from Isia Tadyar. How can we apply Indigenous solutions or ideas without being accused of cultural appropriation?
There are ideas that come out of the book looking at this point in time, we've looked at 250 different technologies. And what has been one of the biggest revelations of the work and this body of work is that we see simultaneous innovation occurring. And we see that there are technologies that are perhaps islanding technologies or forest farming technologies or aquaculture technologies. We see very similar systems, yet the current dominant form of aquaculture is very different to any of these types of systems that we've recognized that there are. I think we've got 47 different types of aquaculture technologies that we've looked at. There is tenets and there's methods and there's understandings about these forms of technologies, these typologies that can inform the way that we're looking. And that's not an appropriation. That's not extraction and reapplication without recognition of communities. There's two ways to think of this. There's not just an advocacy for we need to remove and reapply in a different context without ever acknowledging or without ever just this process of extraction. A lot of the work and a lot of the theory is about saying we need to recognize Indigenous landscapes in situ. We need to think about and assist as designers the process of expanding those in those regions. We need to recognize and say that these are complementary to our ambitions of climate change. And part of our role as designers is to provide advocacy for communities, for these technologies, present solutions to clients to say, like, we don't have to apply a universal homogenizing solution that is evolved in the Netherlands, in Vietnam, or in every single other country on earth. We can have advocacy for these environmental solutions that are in situ, that can expand. So I think the greatest grounds for these ideas could be at this present time being the advocates for in situ solutions that haven't been recognized as being incredibly valuable, all the value that they actually have in those ecosystems and in those landscapes at this point in time.
Yeah, so again, I guess a massive change of mindset has to happen. And conversations like this hopefully facilitate that change. But unfortunately, I think tonight we're down to our last question.
Okay.
And this is regarding the very famous topic of architects and designers and contractors on maintenance. Most of your examples are fantastic. Ecologically sensitive solutions. I mean, you have branches made of trees, single type of reed being used as food and building material at the same time. But one of the concerns of a lot of clients, a lot of builders and developers, not only here in the Philippines but of course globally, um, they actually have a tendency to trust more of these produced, manufactured materials like glass, concrete, steel than natural materials because of the difficulty of maintenance compared to the previous aforementioned materials. Now, if you would encounter clients like this, how do you usually respond, and how should you respond? And obviously, of course, your book and your speaking engagements aim to educate and change mindsets, right? But you personally, how do you respond? And do you think in this lifetime it's possible that,
Yeah.
yeah?
I mean, I have encountered this, and there, there's always this incredible interest and in my experience, there's been incredible interest to think about what could be the potential of integration, but yet maybe some of these systems aren't suitable for the scale, for the density, for the loading, for the massing, and this is mostly talking about architecture. A lot of the systems are actually more synonymous with landscape, and that's my area of expertise. But there's still, I have confronted clients on this topic, and there's more sort of an interest in like, okay, we're not going to get there tomorrow. Maybe we're not going to get there in 6 months, but we need to begin the exploration. And the relationship that I have explored with clients is there a possibility for demonstration? Is there a way that we can introduce single-use material as multiple and within a multiple material technology palette for some part of a demonstration within your project? Perhaps that's part of the facade system. Perhaps that's part of a threshold system. Perhaps, perhaps that's in the sort of the landscape of the project. Is there a way that we can begin that process of exploration through demonstration of the potential? Therefore, the innovation and the research happens as the project occurs. And then there's this really interesting thing that happens, is that there's so many clients that really have, they want to be exploring sustainability. They want to be exploring. They're understanding that we need to confront these issues and the climate crisis. But obviously, there's a misunderstanding as to how it would occur. So we need to be innovators, and we need, as designers, we need to be advocates for this system, and propose these systems to clients, propose these systems within our competitions, and say that, part of this is possible. Let's explore the first steps of how this might be possible, and then let's begin the process of the evolution and the shift, and begin the conversations.
Yeah, I love this idea of progressive change.
Yeah.
Meaning that, hey, it doesn't have to be the whole project, the whole landscape altogether. If, let's say, for one reason or the other, you're not able to pursue what we're trying to advocate, maybe a proof of concept, like what you said, demonstration would be a great first step.
Yeah. Oh, let's always use our wonderful cost-saving technique of phasing. How do we think about phasing a project in this way?
Yeah. Thanks so much for the practical suggestion and lesson right there, Julia. It was such a pleasure chatting with you. We are very honored that you were able to take time off to give such an amazing and informative talk. So as we close, let me just once again give recognition to our partners. Firstly, Adobo Magazine, the official media partner of IDC 2020. Event partners British Council and us at Buen Salido Architects. Thank you as well to the Design Center for championing Better Normal by Design. To close, we have another video from Doctora Marian Alonso, the medical chief of the farm at San Benito, from her Harmonizing series. Let's take a breather, find balance, well-being, and wind the night down with a mindfulness exercise. Good night, everyone.
Good day, everyone. Let us focus on our hearts, feeling the warmth of your hands over the heart, and just breathing in and out, enjoying the rhythm of the breath. The heart is a very important internal organ because it is the only one that can powerfully discern truth from untruth. And in this time of confusion, polarizing opinions as to whatever this pandemic is, it's very important to go back to the heart. And just breathing in and out. Imagining a beautiful place where you feel the most calm. It could be a beach setting, a garden setting. And savoring the breath. Imagining how the gentle air touches against your skin. All healing traditions emphasize the value of breathing. Now we go down to the level of the belly. The belly is the seat of power, the seat of vitality, the seat of creativity. And in terms of design, you would want to bring your breath down to the level of the belly and really connect to this part of your belly, this part of your body that grounds you. Exhale, releasing what does not serve you anymore, so that as you inhale, you have more space for qualities that you want the most. Vitality, joy, inspiration. Now imagine a tree. As the higher the tree goes up, the deeper the roots. And in terms of creativity, you have different levels of thinking. You have the imagination, which is in the level of the head. So imagine the most beautiful version of the future you want to step into. And we go higher up, which is the level of inspired thinking. So it's above the head, but it also goes deeper. It goes also to the level of the chest. So again, going back to this imagination of this wonderful future that you envision, and be inspired about this possibility. And when we say inspired, you're just feeling, how will it look like, how will it feel like if you actually are living this reality. And we go to the highest level of thinking, intuitive thinking. So it goes high up, but it goes very deep as well. So intuition connected to the heights of your thinking, that's what you call intuitive thinking, and it's in the level of the belly. When you're inspired, not just about the idea, but you're inspired into action, then that's intuitive thinking. That's different from gut feeling. Gut feeling would be just a sense, but it's more just on the belly. It doesn't go high up there. So it has to be very rooted on the belly, but going high up. So breathing in and breathing out, and allowing yourself to be joyful, thinking about the steps that you want to take towards this creative idea that you want to birth into this reality. want to birth into this world right now. Going back to the breath. How will it feel like? How will it taste like? How does it feel in your touch? Recruiting all the senses. And when you do that, you allow and you attract more molecules of that beautiful future to gravitate into your now. Take in nature or experiences you've had, refreshing experiences connected to nature, because nature always supports creativity.